Hi. Yes, so as Dr. Cohn just said, I'm Kaitlin, and I will be discussing page layouts and American superhero comics. Before I begin, I just want to make it quick enough that you don't need to worry about reading any of the text and the comic pages I'm going to show you today. So getting started, we have a very basic example of a comic book page. And who here at first glance assumed that this was an older comic, as in not from the last couple of decades? And that's the majority, and y'all would be correct in that assumption. This is actually from Captain Marvel, issue number 1, which came out in 1941. There were probably some visual cues that you relied on to make that assumption, perhaps the color choices or the drawing style, but maybe there were other choices that or other cues that you weren't aware of. For instance, the grid-like structure of the panels, the fact that all the panels are a similar shape and size, and the distinct white boundaries that separate them on the page. Now, whatever it was certainly something, because we know that not all comic pages look like this. In fact, as we start going through the decades to more recent comics, we can see that there are a lot more options available to an artist as they sit down to design their pages. And as we get to this last example here, this is from Batman the Dark Knight, issue number 2. It came out in 2011. And again, right off the bat, you can see some differences between these two examples. For instance, the Batman comic, the pages are now different sizes and shapes. They don't adhere to the same grid-like structure that we saw, and the boundaries between the panels are very small and non-existent, with some panels overlapping others. So, so we have these two panels, or these two pages, and 70 years separate both of them. The differences between them are striking, but the real question is, are they significant? So, are the changes that took place to get the differences between these two comics based on stylistic variation or due to a systematic change in page layout? So, when it comes to analyzing something like page layout or systematic change, in that we can't just rely on what our eyes tell us. We need to conduct careful analysis, as Dr. Cohn mentioned. We need a proper methodology to be sure that what we're seeing is really what's going on and isn't merely just a matter of opinion. So we now have this question: have page layouts changed systematically over the last 80 years? And if we conduct a study to prove that, which we did, which I will show you in just a couple of moments, we should not only be able to answer that question, but if the answer is yes, then we should also be able to say how they have changed. Before we get into the meat of the study, I just want to go over a couple of quick things, some of which you've already seen before. The first is Z-path, which Brock had pointed out, which is just starting in the upper left-hand corner, upper left-hand corner panel, moving over to the right, down again, so on and so forth. However, there are some standard deviations that deviate away from Z-path. One, again, which you've already seen, is blockage, which is merely one larger panel next to two smaller panels stacked one on top of the other. A few other quick examples of deviations. One is staggering, which is when two or more panels are offset from one another on the page. And the last deviation is insets, which is when you have one smaller panel inside of a larger panel. So based on this data and our own predictions, based on this and our experience, we have these predictions that we have laid out. The first of which being that we predicted that pages would become less grid-like over time, just in general. And then stemming from that, we would assume that in the decrease of grid usage, we would see more deviations and the Z-path. So we began our study, and it included comics from the early 40s all the way until last year. In total, we ended up with 40 comics, which means that we individually analyzed 925 pages and tabulated properties for 4,648 panels individually, which took quite a while. So when first starting out, coding these pages or taking notes of the properties within them, we just generally looked at directionality, that being which of these 8 directions would a reader take to get from one panel to the next. And again, when you have an example like this, which you've seen before, this grid-like pattern, we also made note of when a panel was in that larger structure, as in when was a part of a larger grid. And the same can be said for these deviation pages, or panels. So we first took note of the directionality, how did the reader progress through them, but then also made note of when one panel was part of a larger structure, in this case, blockage, which is just a much larger expanded version of the blockage we saw earlier. So, coming up with all that, we have our data. And I'll start off with just the directionality data that we found. The first two directions I want to look at is rightward movement, which had a very gradual but significant dip over time, and the second movement is the downward movement, which had a less significant but still gradual change over time. And I draw your attention to these two directions because if you remember, the z-path is part of is made up of a rightward movement and a downward movement. So we can say that these two movements are decreasing over time, and we can also postulate that grid-like structures or z-path is also decreasing over time. The next direction I'd like to look at is just straight downward movement, which appeared to gradually incline until about the 90s or early 2000s, and then had a quick rise in usage. And this was kind of a mystery, but we can attribute it to something that we call widescreen panels, which is when you have one panel that takes up an entire row, so to speak, on a page. And those of you who read recent comics, this should look very familiar to you, to see large, wide panels stacked one on top of the other all the way down the page. The next two directions we'll look at is just upright and downright movements, which had some spikes here and there, but for the most part didn't change too much over time. And I won't mention the other directions that could be used because they were practically non-existent in the comics that we looked at. The next thing I want to look at is the deviation, or the structures I talked about earlier, the different kinds of qualities that panels can have. The first being grid, so just when was a panel labeled as being in a grid itself. And so that also had a gradual decrease over time. The next thing, which has a very inverse relationship to grid panels, are whole row panels, which we just saw in the widescreen example. And then we looked at blockage, which had a slight increase over time, though not fairly significant rise. And the last two being inset panels, again, maybe a slight rise, and stagnant panels, which had very little change at all. So, looking at this, we can say that, okay, individual panels themselves, there's been some change in the way that they're used on the page, but can we say that for the entire page? After all, this was a study that was conducted on the overall page layouts themselves. So the next graph I'll show you looks at just that. Forgive me for the very random negative data, y-axis there. There's some issues in post-production. Wasn't able to fix that. Yes, so this first line here, this is full page grid. So this is to say that this was for all the pages that had entirely grid panels on them, as in it was like that Captain Marvel example I first showed you. And this did have a gradual increase. The next line we'll look at is one feature per page, which is the deviations from the z-path when there's at least one of those present on a page, which did have a slight increase, again almost inverse to the full page grid line that we see. And the last thing we'll look at is whole row panels, so again, a page that has entirely whole row panels like we saw in the widescreen example. And again, these two lines at the bottom almost an inverse relationship to full grid pages. So we can look at this and say that if full grids are decreasing, something must be taking their place. So we can say that one feature per page, these deviations, these whole row panels must be doing just that. So we now go back to our two original examples, which I showed you, Captain Marvel and then Batman, The Dark Knight, and go back to our original question. Was there a systematic change in page layouts in American superhero comics over the last 80 years? And as of now, with our data, we can definitively say that yes, there was a change to just different options now available, and now we're choosing to use them. And yes, there were, I'll just make a quick last minute note, which I forgot to say, there were other things that we looked at in our studies, such as panel shapes and the boundaries between panels. However, I didn't have time to go over that in this presentation today, but yes, that's